All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming to a panel discussion on supporting BIPOC students or Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and considerations for study abroad. I really appreciate you all being here today. Thanks for coming in on this Monday. I know it's a difficult time of year, but we just got to keep going until Thanksgiving, right? So to start off today, Caroline Zeyer from the Study Abroad office. I'll be moderating the panel today. We'll start off with a land acknowledgement, just a couple of Zoom housekeeping considerations. I'll be introducing all of our awesome panelists and explaining a bit about the Brave Conversation framework. Then we will get into those questions. And finally, we'll share some resources after we have our discussion. So at this time, I'd like to make a land acknowledgement. The ASU Tempe campus was built on the homelands of the Acamil, Atum, and Pipash peoples. We acknowledge these people, their ancestors, their descendants, and the land itself. This statement acknowledges that colonialism is not a past event, but an ongoing process of which we are a part. And also, I'd like to give a little reminder and a shout out to Student Services that this month is Native American Heritage Month. And while we like to celebrate this all days of the year, there are some particular events happening this November. If you'd like to check out the calendar of events, then you can follow that QR code on the screen. And I'll be sending the slides to everybody who registered today. So you can check that out. So a little bit of Zoom housekeeping. Please keep your microphone muted unless you're speaking. You can have your webcam off or on. Love to see some friendly faces, but understand if you do not want to. Our panelists, it would be better to have the webcam on, especially when speaking. And then if you have any questions or comments, it might be best to type in question or comment in the chat box, and we will address those during the presentation and after. All right, so Brave Space today. We'd like to meet controversy with civility. Varying opinions are welcomed and accepted. We'd like to own our intentions and impacts. So acknowledge and discuss instances where a dialogue has affected the emotional well-being of another. We want to challenge by choice. So to have the option to step in and out of challenging conversations. We want respect and having respect shown for one another's basic humanity or personhood. And no attacks, agreeing not to intentionally inflict harm on one another. So if anybody has questions or you would agree, you can put that in the chat now before we move on. Nice. Thank you. Okay. So let's get into some introductions. So first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Rene Bahadi Klug. Rene, or Dr. Klug, brings to her role as Senior University International Educator more than 17 years of English and ESL teaching experience throughout the US and overseas, most recently with ASU's Global Launch. Her mission in this role is to work closely with ASU faculty and staff to help facilitate cross-cultural understanding and produce more successful global student graduates by providing strategic training focused on students' cultural backgrounds and academic needs. She coordinates the Global Advocacy Certificate Program for faculty and staff to grow in their intercultural competency. Welcome, Dr. Klug. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks so much.
All right, up next we have Dr. Kevin Correa, who is the director of the First Year Success Center, which provides individualized and holistic peer coaching services to freshmen, sophomores, and transfer students on 4 ASU campuses. He was part of the leadership team that led the center's growth from an initiative to an award-winning office, which now runs a First Gen Zone conference for faculty and staff each year. It was very good, it just happened. In addition to leading the First Year Success Center, Dr. Correa serves as a faculty associate in the ASU Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College, where he teaches graduate level courses in the higher and post-secondary education program. Welcome, Kevin, Dr. Correa, thank you for being here today. All right, next we have Dr. Olga Idris Davis, who is the Associate Dean and Professor of Barrett the Honors College and Hugh Downs School of Human Communication. She is passionate about enhancing communication to improve the health and well-being of underserved populations. She helped establish a health coalition for refugee women in Maricopa County and was appointed by Governor Napolitano to serve on the State Commission on Women's and Children's Health. In addition, Dean Davis is intricately involved in promoting health among the African American community in Arizona. Welcome, Dean Davis.
Thank you very much, Caroline.
Welcome. Last but not least, we have Dr. Kyle Mox, who is the Associate Dean of National Scholarship Advisement. Dr. Kyle Mox has successfully advised hundreds of applicants for national scholarships and prestigious fellowships, including winners of the Rhodes and Marshall Scholarship, Gilman Scholarship, and Fulbright U.S. Student Program, among others. He creates and manages progressive student development programs that encourage creativity, interdisciplinary thinking, and intensive self-reflection. A main area of scholarly interest is taught in his course, Ethics of Hospitality in Literature and Philosophy, which examines the ethics of being both a host and a guest in another culture by reading global literature, classical texts, and philosophy. Welcome, Dr. Mox.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Welcome. All right, so with that, I'm looking forward to getting into our questions. I'll go ahead and stop my screen share and we can just have our mics on. And I have identified some point people to start off the questions, but anybody can jump in at any time. So let's go with the first one. Kevin, I thought this might be a good one for you to start off with. Thinking about the title of the presentation from your perspective and context, what are your thoughts on the evolution of terms from colored to minorities to people of color to Black, Indigenous, and people of color?
Sure, happy to start. I come to this conversation as someone who studied sociology in my undergraduate career and also has been a long-time diversity educator. And one of the things that we know is that race is a social construct. And that means that it's a way that we categorize people based on appearance and background, which often results in differential treatment in the form of racism. As a social construct, labels and understandings of those labels are neither fixed nor universal. So for example, we know the definition of white has changed and evolved over the years, and there are different understandings of who is or who is not included under white. If you look at the efforts of Middle Eastern and Northern African community, there's been a lot of advocacy from that community to not be listed as white in the US Census as they are currently. Additionally, if you look at one of the communities I belong to, I'm part of the Latinx community, that community, the labels has shifted and changed, and there's not a lot of agreement with those labels, right? Whether it's Hispanic, Latino, or more recently Latinx. We've also seen that there's been a lot of articles in last week alone with that community where there's a lot of diversity within that community, and they don't all think the same, certainly don't vote the same, et cetera. And so all that to say is that it's challenging to find a term that everyone is going to agree with when we think about all racial ethnic minority groups in the United States. We're talking about over 130 million people. So it's always going to be challenging inherently to get a term that all of them will agree with. So I give credit to anyone who tries to come up with a term that that people can get behind. We know that there are advantages and disadvantages when we think about pan-racial or pan-ethnic terms, which would include another one which is not on your list, which is commonly used as Black and brown. And so advantages with these terms are they can help build solidarity, foster community, also with organizing for advocacy. I'll give a story that growing up, I lived in Puerto Rican communities my family's Puerto Rican, I'm Puerto Rican, and that's how I identified it primarily. And it wasn't until I went to undergraduate in a place that had a very low percentage of Puerto Ricans that I then started identifying, in addition to Puerto Rican, I was identifying as part of the Latino community, not what many people call Latinx community, because of the ability to have a broader network of people with whom I could identify and find a sense of belonging, which we know is so important for success in college. And so how the context that we live in will often shape how people identify. So there's lots of different advantages, but we also know there are disadvantages. Disadvantages often can include overlooking the differences that exist within groups, because we know there is a lot of diversity within these groups. And it can mislead people into thinking that groups are homogenous and monolithic, which we know is not the case. In fact, a training I recommend if you want to learn about these concepts further is ASU's To Be Welcoming curriculum, which is really excellent trainings developed by ASU faculty experts on these subjects. And there's a course on Asian communities, and they talk a lot in that course about efforts to actually disaggregate data when talking about Asian communities, because in that community there's so many differences. And so there's advantages and disadvantages. And I think when we see an evolution of terms, that tells you, that's an indication that people are not satisfied with the terms that are being used, and they're looking for better options. And so, those are my main feelings on the terms in terms of my own sort of personal view. I'm not at a point right now where I'm comfortable using BIPOC myself, just because as a member of the Latinx community, I feel that group is left out. And so I feel it's an incomplete term. Considering that Latinx community is 18% of our population in the United States, and even higher here in Arizona and at ASU. And I also wonder too about the Asian community, which we know has seen an increase in violence and bias as a result of the pandemic. I also wonder about our Arab community, which has been targeted a lot ever since 9/11. And for me, you talked about intent versus impact at the beginning. And so even though intentions of terms might be really good, I worry about the impact, and in particular what I perceive can be the dangers of what we call the oppression Olympics, which is where we get into different minority groups sort of competing with each other to articulate who has it worse or who needs more support. And I personally feel that there are no winners in that contest. So it's not a contest I like to engage in. And then some additional insight I can offer as a member of the LGBTQ+ community is that I've seen over the years how different letters can be added because different people feel left out in different terms, right? So in the 1970s, you had primarily the gay and lesbian community, and then bisexual community were saying, what about us? Add us. So then it was LGB, and then transgender people were saying, what about us? And then it became LGBT, and then Q, and then some people adding the I and the A at the end. And so I feel like that's a potential risk with BIPOC is a lot of people saying, what about us? And, can we get added? And so maybe there's a different term that maybe has a letter for multiple groups beyond only Black and Indigenous. And so those are some thoughts that I would like to share with that. I think in general, whenever we're talking about identities, it's always best, I feel, to respect how an individual self-identifies. And then when we're talking about communities, just to be intentional when considering how narrow or broad to be based on the topic of conversation. And then going back to the topic of today, study abroad, I think one of the great things, wonderful things about study abroad is that it allows more opportunity to go in depth in exploration of these ideas and see how other people conceive of these identities and these terms.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. There's definitely, some different dimensions it'll enter when you go into another culture. Any other thoughts on that topic?
I'd like to say something. This is Dean Olga Davis. One of the things I think more foundationally I'd like to just comment, where as a communication scholar and also a rhetorical theorist and critical rhetorical theorist by training, I look at language. I look at the ways in which we use language to separate people, the way in which we use language to identify them, and then we as humans perform different aspects of those names. So for example, if you're identified as you know, some of the epithets that we still see, even we've seen them around our campus. If you identify people by that term, then there are also other aspects of that term that people either embrace or resist, or they struggle to make sure that those are the terms that they will not be known by. So this idea of naming, certainly with Patricia Hill Collins' work, some of my work over the years, I've talked about naming from the perspective of Black feminism and womanism. And so those theoretical conceptual frameworks talk about that naming is very important to be able to name your own identity, name your own struggle, name your own sense of self. But when we look at some of these evolutions, Caroline, that you've provided for us, that was embedded in the Black experience. The idea of colored, the idea of, you know, I'm thinking all the way back, you know, 1619, 400 years ago, when people of African descent were ripped from their country, ripped from their continent, and then placed in a variety of different, they weren't even, some of them weren't even countries yet, but we call it the disbursement of the Black or African diaspora, because diaspora, they were dispersed across the globe. And they were not seen as humans. So even the word colored, you know, even before, that's you know, that was a nice term, but other terms that go along with identifying Africans at that time were Negroes, which we kept, you know, that term well into the 50s, into the 60s. We sometimes see it still. But this idea that a human being is less than an animal is where we came from in our country, the United States of America, in naming people. And so when we talk about the evolution of how did these names come about, we have to also talk about the centrality of it. Where did it begin? How did we get to the place where we're trying to define who are people seen as, and what do they want to see themselves as? We have to see that this evolution started because one human being said another human being was less than a human. Dogs got a better treatment than humans of an African descent who were called, I won't use the terms, but I think everybody knows what I'm talking about. So that evolution is where we are now. And I think in anything, you do have to find and understand the history and the nature of this idea of naming to appreciate where we are today.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So thinking about all of that history to get us here today, when we're thinking about all of the uncertainties and inequities historically that have existed in study abroad, Kyle and Olga, I thought you might be good to answer this question from your recent experience developing a study abroad program for Barrett. What could be a reason, or multiple reasons, that a student of color may think study abroad is not for me? And how do we change that narrative?
If you never see anyone that looks like you doing something, you don't think it's possible. Also, if you don't think you have any money, you wouldn't think to have that sort of expenditure. And so those are two things that I spend a lot of time and with my office and our programs combating. And it's not really just about program design, it's just about getting people into the door in the first place. So I'm the campus representative for the Benjamin A. Gilman International Scholarship Program, which is a Department of State program that provides up to $5,000 to Pell Grant recipients to pay for study abroad. But if you're a Pell Grant recipient, you're probably beginning with the belief that you can't afford to study abroad in the first place. And the study abroad office does a wonderful job of catching these students when they do arrive, as do we in my office, but we have to ensure that they arrive. So the question is, how do we get them to take that first step? And that's why I also believe very strongly in being a highly visual office and being a very hospitable office as well. And so trying as hard as possible to make sure that students can see every imaginable type of student engaging with our programs. I think that visualization is really important.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dean Mox. I would also agree that oftentimes students of color may not see themselves because they don't believe that they have the money. The money is not there. And we at Barrett are trying to do a lot of things to help our students of color to be able to see that they too should be there, that they have the desire to go oftentimes, but they're holding back because of financial issues. So, you know, travel grants certainly will help. The other thing too, I think, is that we need a cultural competency and a sense of cultural sensitivity, even from some of our offices, from our student populations as well. And I don't think that anyone necessarily means harm, but oftentimes there's just a lack of knowledge about how to interact with Black students or other students of color, Indigenous students. And so then we put the burden of proof or the burden of expectation on them for them to create relationships with the students who they go with, or the program managers or the facilitators or the professor, or the office of employees and staff who are helping develop those programs. Then it suddenly becomes those students, the expectation or the burden is on them to figure out how they fit into the program. And oftentimes, if you don't feel that there's a culture of belonging or culture of belongingness, that people really don't want you in, they may not say it, but their attitude that you really don't belong here, or we don't know how to talk to you, you're such an alien that we don't know what to do with you, then they feel that and they won't want to come. They won't want to be involved in study abroad programs. Then also, I agree with my colleague, Dean Mox, when he mentioned about if you don't see people who look like you, then you also don't necessarily know that you can do that. You know, it's good to be able to see individuals who do this sort of thing. And I go back to history. Most study abroad folks, offices, most students, most parents don't know about the history of people of color who have always traveled across the world, in decades ago. You know, I'm thinking in the Black community, we had writers and artists, intellectuals who traveled abroad. It wasn't like, that Black people didn't travel. You know, I'm thinking of James Baldwin. I'm thinking of the writer and dancer and intellectual Maya Angelou. I'm thinking of Sonia Sanchez and Nikki Giovanni, and and the list goes on. Toni Morrison and so many others. And of course, there are also professors who have gone, but not Paul Robeson, who was a great singer, operatic singer, who also spoke to the people of these various countries in Russia, a variety of different places in Europe. And when we don't see or know that we're not the first person who ever traveled outside of the U.S. who was Black or Native American or Latinx or any of the other races, we suddenly feel we're an oddity. And I hope that we can somehow, as a team of people with the SAO and other groups and other, certainly what we're doing at Barrett, to dispel some of those misunderstandings and those inaccuracies. There has been a history of people of color who have traveled abroad, and oftentimes they traveled because in the United States they weren't treated as human beings. They were seen as I said earlier, if you know that you are a human being, you have 2 legs, 2 arms, you have the accoutrements that look like you're a human entity, but yet you see that dogs and cats are even embraced in ways that you're not, then you figure there's got to be a place on earth that I can go. And so oftentimes they left and went to France, they went to Italy, England. And while those countries had racism as well, there was a sense of embracing them, at least as human beings, in ways that they were not given that right in their own countries. And so many of the artists and the writers, painters, intellectuals, activists, they left the US and were embraced and lived many years in some of those other countries. So again, history in knowing for our students of color, when they don't see themselves in programs, if we change the narrative by creating study programs, study abroad programs, where they see the history of others who have been, and where oftentimes even their majors, I'm thinking of those who might be, I'm thinking now of athletes who might be interested in tennis. They might be interested in going to Wimbledon. Maybe we take them to England and they have a chance to go to Wimbledon to see a tennis match, or maybe even people of color who have broken that barrier in the particular sport. So I do believe there are lots of different things we can do to change that narrative.
I could add one thing that Dean Davis, she got me thinking as she was talking, that we've had this conversation in Barrett in developing our travel programs, and I know the Study Abroad Office has as well, as that it also depends on the locations to which we're traveling. There's a overwhelming preference for Western Europe, and not to mention just the overwhelming presence of Eurocentrism in our humanities curriculum. And so I've talked to people like, oh, sure, I'd love to go to Asia after I've gone to Europe. It's sort of like there's a hierarchy of places. You must go first. I must go to Paris and London first, and then maybe I'll start to consider Istanbul. And I think if we change that in some way and make it seem it's an equal choice, right? And even in the Gilman program, you can strongly favor your odds by choosing a less common location, like in South America or Africa or the Middle East or Asia. You can disadvantage yourself by choosing anything in Western Europe, because that's where the majority of our study abroad goes. So I think programmatically, that's one thing that maybe we can widen the doorway a bit of students who might be interested if we went to places that actually speak to their own histories a bit more than Western Europe.
If I could just add something, Caroline. Dean Mox and I have a plan to go to Amsterdam, to take a group to Amsterdam, and I'm so excited about this, and I think he is too. However, with the pandemic and the potential of the vaccine and so forth, we have postponed it for a year. We were going to go in 2021. We're going to keep everything that we have and see what we're going to do in 2022. But I mentioned that simply to say, in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, certainly, it's in Europe, but we are going to be looking at the multitudes of individuals and of cultures who have helped make Amsterdam and the Netherlands in general what it is. For example, there's a lot. If you look at the colonization period and the role that the Dutch played in colonizing the African and the East Indian cultures. And then where are those individuals now? Where are those cultures today in Amsterdam, for example? So, one of my interests in reimagining what we can do in honors, I've kind of coined the phrase reimagining honors, but also part of reimagining honors is reimagining study abroad programs as well. And when we talk about reimagining, it's saying, how do we rethink and include others who also make those places what they are? Their blood, sweat, and tears, and deaths, and so forth, and foods and cultures have also helped embrace who they are and embrace what that culture and that country is. So we're going to be doing some of that illuminating and reimagining when we do go to Amsterdam. What about the blend of the East Indian representations? What happened when the Dutch colonized these various cultures and brought them over also to Amsterdam? What do we learn? How have they helped to value or become or have Amsterdam and the Netherlands to be invaluable because of the culture that they brought to that country. Yeah.
Oh, there's so much room for intersectionality there. I love
Mhm.
that. I look forward to seeing that in 2022. Especially one of my favorite topics, just being a member of the community, is the LGBTQ plus or rainbow community. And Amsterdam is such a good location to look at the intersection of race and LGBTQ plus history. So that sounds fascinating. Thank you.
We have that
And
on the agenda as well.
nice. Oh, good. Cool. Well, that leads me to very well into the next question. So Dr. Klug, I'd like to direct this one for you. STEM students here may be one of the few or the only people of color in their classes or their schools. This has been very common for study abroad as well, as we've mentioned. What is some advice you have, especially if you are one of the few people of color in your own department?
Yes. Hi, thank you. I think I'm East Indian myself, and one thing that we have all talked about today is this idea of belonging and the need to belong. And from a theory, 1995, Baumeister and Leary, the need to belong is one of the only universals where every single one of us, excepting those who are sociopathic or psychopathic, have a need to belong. And yet, so many of us, particularly those of us situated in the United States, have been the only. We have been the only Asian or person of color, to be more broad, or the only member of the LGBTQIA plus community. And that can feel as if we don't belong because of that lack of representation and that feeling of isolation. And so I want to encourage people that it's a start and you do belong. But I think the thing that is really important is that, like I think Kevin was saying, cultures are not monolithic, and you are not responsible for carrying the burden of your entire community or communities. And then the other thing, and where we've talked a lot about intersectionality, and this is where identities intersect and they collide. And so I, and just mentioning intersections, I would consider myself a woman and a woman of color. So those are two bits of intersection. And this is where, when we talk about power dynamics, where in places of privilege may I not feel a sense of belonging? But in looking at our intersectionalities and those aspects of our identity that we can choose to express or withhold, I want to have a sense of empowerment of where I am going to express who I am when I feel safe doing so, and where I feel like I can withhold that, not in being disingenuous, but in creating a boundary that's an act of self-compassion. And so if you find yourself to be the only, remember those boundaries. Also remember that, that you are not there to express any one of your identities. You are there to be who you are. And that full expression of who you are, whether or not it seems to others representative of whatever identity they want to foist on you, that's not their responsibility, it's your responsibility. And so I hope that that makes sense. I hope that that has a sense of empowerment. I studied abroad in high school and again in college in the early and mid 90s. And I will say, as growing up in Arizona, where it was not very diverse and people didn't understand what it meant for me to be Indian. They thought that I was from the Native American community, and there's so much miseducation and uneducation. And even though I'm referring back to the 70s and 80s, in the 90s when I did finally study abroad, I felt so seen in other nations. I felt like finally I had a place where people understood even a little bit who I was, where I could access parts of my culture that I felt had been eclipsed where I grew up. And so there was a sense of emerging identity that, for me, studying abroad actually helped me access those parts of my Indianness that I felt like I didn't know how to grasp here in the United States, because maybe, and this was a choice that I made inadvertently, maybe I was trying to mask my brownness or my Indianness for the sake of a white community. But once I went abroad, once I took that risk, I realized that fully expressing who I was part of me representing a larger community, not the only person representing that community, but being one voice in expression to many, especially because I'm biracial. So anyway, I think that's it, and that's the advice that I have, is put your boundaries up and take big risks.
Thank you for sharing that. It's really great to hear like a success story journey within study abroad. Any other thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, you know, one could always say, you know, you look different from other people, but when you, and I think this is the Professor Klug was also saying, when you travel abroad, you also see that there are things that you really do have in common with others. I found this to be true when I've taught in China. I teach in China, well, the last 4 years in the summer in Chengdu, China. I've traveled to Portugal, I've traveled to Peru, I've been to Africa, several of the countries in Africa. And they weren't on a study abroad as terms of a program. This was my own study as a professor, or I was invited to teach, like in Italy. But I have found that when you have a broad sense of who you are, like, for example, who would have thought, you might be thinking that you're a universal human being. You are a universal citizen. So wherever you go is where you're supposed to be. I mean, I was taught that as a child. My parents said, you are here to meet people around the world and say hello to them. And at that time we could embrace, and I always enjoy that warmth of spirit of another human being. Certainly being aware that there's hate, being aware that people are going to see you differently, maybe in a negative way, but maybe, just maybe, there's an opportunity to change that because you have taken the opportunity to say, hello, I'm Olga Davis. What you doing there? What's happening? How's it going? And they may not even have the same language that you do, but something about a smile, a touch, eye contact, not looking away. I've had that in my own country, right here in Arizona. You walk into a store, you walk into a restaurant, and people will look away, not even ask, you know, may I help you? But there's a look away. And it's not that, you know, maybe they're just uncomfortable. And so you want them to feel comfortable. So, you know, you might leave so they're more comfortable with your absence there. But when you travel abroad and you can see that someone is looking you in the eye and smiling, and you give that back, there's a universality that we talk about in literature, certainly, but there's a universality in the realness of being a real human being, of being someone who can touch another human being just by the energy that we can't really capture. I tell my students, it's the zzz. It's the zzz, and the zzz means the energy that we can't see, that we can't touch, but we know it's there. So when you feel a connection with someone, it might be love, might be an attraction, you know, you can't touch it, you can't grab it, but you know there's something there. And that, to me, is the basis of being a universal citizen, that zzz that connects us as humans.
Absolutely. I miss that a lot. Just being in cultures also that maybe touch is not as a familiar thing. Just thinking about some countries I've been to in East Asia, laughter was always my zzz moment. If you find a joke or you both think something's funny, you can laugh about it. You don't have to speak the same language, but it was always great. So shifting back, Dr. Correa, next one's for you. So thinking about traveling in a group for the first time. As a student of color, it's often very helpful for students to hear from others they can identify with. What are some anecdotes that come to mind from your own travels or leading study abroad that would be good to hear about?
Sure. So, well, just to clarify with this question, I've actually never gone on a study abroad trip or led a study abroad trip. All my international travels have been sort of private vacation type experiences. That said, if there was one thing I could do all over again as an undergraduate, by far, without a doubt, it would be study abroad. I think it's such a unique opportunity, and I was one of those students for whom study abroad was not on my radar. I was a first generation college student. That's why my background, we're celebrating National College First Celebration Day. And so I didn't know about study abroad. I certainly didn't think, even if someone told me about it, that I would be able to afford it. And so it was really more after college where I started having the opportunities to go abroad. And I would just say, sort of going back to what Dean Mock said earlier, and really all the panelists have said this, is in some way, or alluded to this, is there's can be really wonderful power in being able to travel to places where your family comes from. And so I know for me as an adult, traveling to Puerto Rico for the first time, or actually when I was a young child, but very young, so didn't remember too much about it. So for the first time as an adult, that was just a really particularly significant experience. And then similarly, just last year, I had the opportunity to go to Spain. And for me, it was just very special to be there and to feel more in touch with my ancestors. And I'll never forget the feeling I had when I stepped foot for the first time in the Mediterranean Sea. It was just really almost like a spiritual experience for me, because I know there's so much history in that body of water. And so I think these are the types of experiences that people can have when they go to places or regions where they know their families are from. And so that's definitely something I would highly recommend as one of the many, many benefits of going abroad.
You know, can I add really quickly? I taught students for 17 years, and the number one thing I would always say to them is, please go visit the study abroad office. And we had mentioned earlier about cost prohibitions, but here's my argument, especially if parents are feeling uncertain, is the beauty of studying abroad while you're in a university is that you are kind of under the covering of the university. You have a schedule. A lot of times when we travel, it can feel kind of random. We jump on and off of trains, but here there's a mission. You're going to class. There's you know, you're a captive audience, if you will. A lot of times you pay tuition to your current or your local university that gets shifted over. And so there's all of these, nothing is easy, but it's one less kind of risk it seems to take. And I think that just encouraging students to recognize that if you do it this time, it really does feel an extra level of safety. And that's, I think, why I loved it so much. And I kept doing it again and again in high school and college, and then in grad school, and then beyond when I taught in Madagascar. And so it's one of those things that if you can align with an organization that you trust, especially at your university, and get credits to boot. So if you look on my transcripts, I took a bunch of classes in Shakespeare in England. That was pretty amazing. And it's true what Kevin was saying, you know, just stepping foot on a land where you know that centuries ago, your relatives were there. There is something really emboldening about that.
Yeah, I agree with that too. You know, we've taken students to England, Scotland, and Ireland in the program that I was in my home department, which is the School of Communication. And I saw how students grew so much just being on the actual land, to be able to study something that Shakespeare wrote, or to hear a piece of music from a composer who actually lived and breathed and walked around that area in different parts of England. It means so much. We also have had some of our own students at Barrett. I'm happy to say we were so excited about students who were first generation students, Latinx students, I'm thinking particularly, who are at the top of their game as students in their various majors. And they were able to be awarded an opportunity to go to the Olympics, the 2020 Olympics. Well, we knew what happened with that, but we were so excited, and they were as well, because they've done what they needed to do. They were prepared. They were interested in going and being journalists and learning about journalism from the perspective of being in the Olympics. And then, of course, COVID-19 came. But just to have had those opportunities, and of course, we're hoping that the Olympics will occur this following year, and we may be able to still get them over, hopefully to Japan. But my point here is simply that if you see it, if you can dream it, I'm thinking of the Field of Dreams, that movie that said, if you build it, they will come. If you teach them, they will come. If they see themselves in it, they will come. If they see the value of who they are, I believe identity is so important. You see the value of who you are and the extension of who you are by traveling and getting to know the world, getting to know others on the world stage, which we help to develop students to see that in the Barrett Honors College. Then I think there are more opportunities to open that door, open that window, whatever metaphor you'd like to use, for students of color. That's Black, Indigenous, East Indian, Latin, everybody, Asian, all the different groups. And when I think about this, we talk about students of color, but I'm always saying we're not just singling them out, because our students who are considered Anglo students, this is their history too, the history of the United States and how people have been disenfranchised is part of their history too. And they have to also understand the value of knowing students outside of their comfort zone. Oftentimes and as they get older, and students, sometimes faculty go, well, I don't know what I can contribute because I'm just a white woman or a white man. I don't know what I can do. Oh, there's so much, so much. If nothing more, highlighting the opportunity of being privileged so that people can see privileges can be a site in which you can have a voice to say, we have to make this right. We have to equalize and have to make sure that we have equity for all. So there's something that everyone can do if we take a moment to recognize where our position is. We call that positionality, and move from there to make it a more equitable opportunity for everyone.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I really didn't see my positionality until I studied abroad. And that sparked just a need in me to be like, I have to be an active ally. I didn't know what the term ally was at the time in my 20s, but early 20s. But that's what started me thinking about it and really, really seeing those social inequities and injustices. But enough about me. Actually, Olga, Dean Davis, this next question is for you. After experiencing racism in the US, what are some ways attitudes toward race and other cultures could be similar or different based on your experience? We've touched on this a little bit, but to bring it more specifically out.
Yeah, Caroline, can you give me a little bit more? I was grappling with that because I'm not quite sure. I think I need you to articulate that a little bit more, if you could.
Absolutely. So, and An example I can think of that came to mind when I was looking through our student blogs recently was an anecdote from a student who identifies as Black female. She traveled in Morocco, and as a sub-Saharan country where there's a lot of immigration and migration coming through from perhaps refugees from other countries in Africa, they're not always seen in a very positive light. So after experiencing racism in the US as a Black woman, she then again experienced it, but in a different cultural context of being, yes, colorism. So it was a really good example of colorism. So navigating that was very different, but similar to what she had experienced before. So I'm wondering how students might have similar experiences and how they could find resilience and develop themselves with that.
Well, first of all, you threw out the word, and I think Professor Bahati Klug also did too, the notion of colorism. And from the perspective of African Americans, that term colorism means the hegemonic levels of privilege that comes in what at least used to, and there's still vestiges of it remaining even today, where the lighter you are, the closer you are to looking white or of the Anglo-Saxon race, you are seen as more valuable. You have more privileges. The darker you are, the fewer privileges you have. And there's a spectrum of course, complexions. And of course, we also know that came out of slavery. There's that history again that I mentioned early on. And so I think probably this idea of colorism and how it might transfer over into other countries we might be talking about. I've not been to Hungary, but I certainly know from some of the things that I've read, and more recently, a couple of months ago, there was a great program on 60 Minutes about Hungary, really shutting its borders to immigrants. And they were mentioning immigrants that are coming from East Africa, Central Africa, and other places, that they only want a pure race of Hungarians. And the president, I think he was called, of the country, said, we don't want their food, we don't want their tastes, we don't want their spices, we don't want anything about them. We only want what is all Hungarian. So that's one place you wouldn't want to go if you were a student who was at least that you could see you looked different, that your phenotype was completely different. You certainly wouldn't want to go there. But there are other places as well. I think I would say students need to be aware of the tenor or the temperature or the tone that's going around the country, around the world rather, globally, how serious it might be if you do travel abroad. In 2018, for my sabbatical, I was asked to come and teach at the University of Genova, which is the home site of Christopher Columbus. And we say in American English, we say Genoa, or sometimes we say Genova, but the Italians say Genova. And I traveled around Italy during the time that I was there. And I also found myself being, as this student you mentioned, Caroline, rather uncomfortable, some not uncomfortable, cautious, because I am always aware of who I am and also how I look, but also how I present myself. And there is a sense to some degree that Americans might be treated differently than others. But then you have that aspect of what you look like, your color. And white Americans, we don't even call them white Americans. We just call them Americans. You go someplace and you're just called, oh, those American students are there. But if you are of another race, like I can only relate to my own cultural perspective. If you are of African descent, you are an African or African American, then that is what you are identified. You are Black American, as opposed to just American. And so being aware of the kinds of political issues that are happening at the time. When I was in Italy, I was careful about the background that was happening with East Africans. There were Ethiopian individuals, quite a large Ethiopian population was in Italy. And that is historical as well. And on my father's side, I do have of Ethiopian, I have an Ethiopian background from Djibouti. Djibouti is no longer in Ethiopia, but a long time ago it was. And so I do favor the people. I favor Ethiopians. And they come up to me and start talking Amharic because I look so much like Ethiopian people. And so also being aware of how Italians and the Italian government was treating immigrants from Ethiopia. I was just on watch, on guard, not paranoid, but just aware and aware of my surroundings. And then those who were my friends and my colleagues who I traveled with were of course aware, but not where we had to feel in danger, never in danger. We never felt in danger, but you go with an awareness. You go with being very conscious and aware. I always think of consciousness raising. When you know who you are and you know who you are not, then you can navigate just about anywhere. It really takes a focus on you. You have to know who you are in terms of your self-identity and how you present yourself in the world, but also you're aware of the world and the history that could show its ugly head at any time, at anywhere. I hope that helps a little bit, Caroline. I don't know if I answered the question, but I gave it a shot.
It does absolutely help. Thank you. I want to be aware and respectful of everyone's time. I know that it is just about 3 o'clock. And if anybody needs to go to another appointment or class, then I totally understand. We do have a couple more questions if anybody would be willing to stay. If not, I can totally wrap it up and just remind everybody of some resources. So what is everybody's thoughts on that? Awesome. Thank you, Rene. Okay, no worries. Perfect. Excellent, thank you. Great. So we'll have a little bit smaller, but a mighty group. All right. So moving on, let's see. I'm sorry, I got a little bit lost in the flow.
I'll use that moment to say thank you for organizing this and thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed listening to all these different perspectives. So please do follow up with me if you all have any other questions about fellowships to support these opportunities.
Thank you, Kyle. It was great to have you today. And I always enjoy interacting with Anza.
Great.
Y'all are the best. Thank you. Oh, I just want to read from Melissa really quick. I cannot thank you all enough for this meeting. This made me feel validated with many of the thoughts and feelings I have about study abroad and race and just life experiences in general. Oh, that's so powerful. Thank you, Melissa. I really appreciate that. Wonderful. And Christine says, yes, thanks to all. I teach a class on ethics and alternative tourism. Oh my gosh, awesome. So if anyone wanted to share resources about that, that would be terrific. Ooh, that sounds like a really interesting subject. Love it. Cool. Thank you, Christine. All right. So we'll get back into the meat of it. So Rene, you're up next. How do you potentially see identity intersection and the pressure of a student being expected to represent a whole identity happening in a new setting?
I think it is inappropriate, but I will say, I will share back in when I was studying abroad in England, I decided to take an American Lit course because that ultimately was what, I really, I studied. I just wanted to see what it would feel like to be an American in a class full of non-Americans. Anyway, I think we were reading The Great Gatsby, and the professor, who happened to be from New Zealand, calls me out and says, Miss Bahati, not his accent, sorry, I can't do it. And he said, what do Americans think about abortion? It's like, really? And it was, and I like to share it because of the absurdity of it. He was brilliant, no doubt about that, but just the idea that there was one, even back in 1997, I'm afraid to tell everybody, I don't think Americans have ever been aligned on their perspective on abortion. And the fact that he expected me as a teenager to somehow just encapsulate what all of the United States thought about this very, very big idea. And I think that, I can make light of it and laugh about it now, but it's not appropriate to be expected to represent your entire culture, because you simply cannot. And in the same way that when we look at us, if I look at my Indian family here in the United States, we all have different practices. And because culture is dynamic, and we bring to each of our families a culture. And so, so here at ASU, I train faculty and staff on cultural intelligence. And part of that is reminding people to get to know others individually. Yes, there is a little bit of onus of responsibility to understand some cultural dynamics, but when it comes to understanding how to understand people, you have to get to know people, and not just a few bullet points that you may have found on Google. And I say that it's an aggressive statement, but I think sometimes people feel, well, if I just knew A, B, and C, I could get along just fine in whatever culture with whatever people. And I frankly have found that that's just not true. Is it difficult? And I think Dean Davis has said, is it uncomfortable? Yes, but I think being uncomfortable is a really good first place to start when we are talking about interacting with others or developing cultural intelligence. That I can say, I feel really uncomfortable right now, but I'm going to push past my discomfort. I'm going to become self-aware to say, okay, why am I feeling uncomfortable? What can I do to not just get rid of it, but to understand it and perhaps push past it so I can be more educated. And so I can get to know this person and get to know this culture in a little bit more based on the people that I meet. So I don't know. And please, professors, don't call out certain students and have them represent. I think it's best, and sometimes I think it can be interesting to say, oh, what do you think about that? But maybe open it up to the whole room. And if those students feel comfortable speaking about their personal experiences, then that is okay. But to ask a student directly, well, what does your culture think about X? A, the student may not know, and B, there's very likely one right answer. And so maybe open it up, or survey, do something that's more private, pull the student aside if you would like to have their take, and ask them how they feel about sharing of their culture, but certainly don't dictate anything, and please don't put them on the spot.
Absolutely. I also think it's good to point out sometimes the privilege of feeling uncomfortable. And if you are perhaps seeking to learn more about yourself and you offend somebody or somebody confronts you, it's a privilege to have that learning experience, especially if you're trying to be a good ally. Thank you. Oh, I just want to say Raphael commented, that is such an interesting story given this past election. The misconceptions of voting blocks based on ethnicity would vote a particular way because of how we perceive people to be a part of monoliths instead of individuals. Yes. Very true. Thank you, Raphael. And I think to wrap it up, Kevin, you have the honor of getting the last question of the day. I think that's actually a great transfer into this because especially these days, I think it's important to lift each other up in times of uncertainty, pain, you know, the world being what it is, this 2020, and to know that we are not alone. We are all human and we're connected in our humanity. So what are some affirmations you would like our audience to leave with today?
Thank you. And I'm also very mindful of gender dynamics. And so as a man, I do not need to have the last word. So please, other people feel free to chime in. I would say a couple affirmations that come to mind for me is one is actually a positive spin on what's usually used in a more negative way, which is, but I think it is applicable, which is sort of the phrase, wherever you go, there you are. And so I like to think about that in a positive way. It's like wherever you go, you're still yourself, right? You still bring your strengths, your talents, your gifts to anywhere you go in the country and your education, and nobody can take that from you. And so remember who you are and be grounded in who you are, no matter where you go, because who you are matters and who you are is valuable. And so never forget that, number one, first and foremost. And then sort of related to that, I would add a famous quote from Eleanor Roosevelt, which is, nobody can make you feel inferior without your consent. And so if you are in a place where people are giving you, bad looks or mistreating you, just maintain that sense of self and that sense of internal strength, and know that you are not less than, and you are never less than anybody else, no matter where you are. And like you said, Caroline, you're not alone. There are other people, as Dr. Davis shared earlier. You're not the first one to have traveled or gone abroad, and so have strength in that. And you can do amazing things. And the one thing I'll say is I've spoken to many students who have gone abroad as ASU students, and not one has ever told me that they regretted that experience. What they tell me is that it's actually been the opposite. It's been a life-changing experience, and they've grown so much from it, and they can't wait to do it again. And so those are some encouraging words that I would like to share with people, but I'm happy to open up to other people too.
Well, thank you so much for that. That point, very, very nice. I want to just mention a couple of things because I am going to have to go. But one is one of my own personal mottos, and that is seize the day. Seize the day. Take everything you can. Capture everything in the 24 hours that we have. I don't want to sound too grim and gloom, but we have seen a lot of death in our country over the course of the last 7 or 8 months because of COVID-19. And some of us may have even lost relatives. But when you think of our lives, we only have today. We may have had yesterday, we might have tomorrow, but we certainly know we have right where we are today. So seize it by taking wonderful trips abroad, seize it by getting outside of your comfort zones. And I do agree that it's good to be uncomfortable if you have the privilege of being uncomfortable, but use that privilege to get to know other people and seize the day in knowing others. Then my second affirmation would be Maya Angelou, a wonderful poet, died about 2 years ago, I think it is now. The great American poet Maya Angelou, who says, "We are more alike than unalike." And I may have mentioned that earlier, but I keep going back to that because when we take the time to move out of the ideologies that keep us separate, and we find the similarities of just humanity, then we really do find that we are more alike than unalike. And travel allows that. And finally, my last piece, I just put this on in case I might put this put a bug in the ear of some of our SAO folks. And that is when we travel, we have found that oftentimes some of the host organizations that are preparing the bids for us and preparing where we go. They're the on the ground developers. Oftentimes we don't use the actual indigenous people from those cultures. And there may be some entrepreneurs who actually have opportunities to help us in preparing our study abroad program. So just a bug in the ear that we want to make sure that we are spreading the wealth around and helping some of those wonderful entrepreneurs who are on the ground, who need our help as well, and have some wonderful places that they can take our students and all of our different programs if we can give them some opportunities to do that. Thank you, Caroline, for putting this together. Thank you, panelists, my colleagues. I appreciate you so much. Thank you for today. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dean Davis.
Caroline, can I share one quick quote?
Of course, go ahead.
So I'll share it in the chat. This is from my favorite book. She's an East Indian writer. She's Bengali, Jhumpa Lahiri. It's from Interpreter of Maladies. And the final story is about a man who has traveled abroad, and he's from India, and he's finally looking back at his life in the United States. And he says, "I am not the only man to seek his fortune far from home, and certainly I am not the first. Still, there are times I am bewildered by each mile I have traveled, each meal I have eaten, each person I have known, each room in which I have slept. As ordinary as it all appears, there are times when it is beyond my imagination."
I love that quote. Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, what's life without a little mystery, right? Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much, panelists, Dr. Klug and Dr. Correa, for staying a bit over time, and Dean Davis as well. I'm going to close up the conversation by showing some resources. So anybody who needs to get off is totally welcome to. As it's recorded, I just want to keep this all for posterity. Any questions from the audience, actually, before I share the resources prepared today? Perfect. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen again. So just a little bit of, I always like to leave with a to-do list after a nice dialogue. So first, anybody from D&I team, if you could pop these links down in the chat, I would really appreciate it. For the ASU Study Abroad Supporting Diversity section, if you go to mystudyabroad.asu.edu, I have a screenshot there, but there is a section called Supporting Diversity, and you might find the section on racially or ethnically diverse students particularly helpful. It is a bit divided up in general by heritage or ethnicities, but there are some resources such as scholarships and country considerations that somebody may find particularly useful. And we also have sometimes, depending on the program, a special considerations tab, and you can find special considerations in all of our program brochures. Sometimes there will be additional language on racial and ethnic minority abroad. So this is an example of a program that is going to France and Austria. It won't be included in all programs. It's more for those very significant socio-political situations, such as laws against discrimination, if those don't exist there, or if there's a particular history of colonization that we like to call out just for students to start thinking ahead. And Dean Mox left this just to let everybody know, and as a reminder, the link there, and everybody will get the slides after this, for the Office of National Scholarship Advisement Programs. We did talk about this a bit, but there is the Gilman Scholarship still available, and in addition for virtual study abroad programs now, which is very cool. The Fulbright US Student Program, the Pickering and Ringel Fellowships, PPIA Junior Summer Fellowships. And you can find all the other scholarship lists on onza.asu.edu. And we did mention earlier the Global Advocacy Certificate Program for faculty and staff. I'm participating this year. It's been wonderful. Dr. Klug runs that program. And Dr. Correa has left some helpful links for the First Year Success Center, the Office of Inclusion and Community Engagement at ASU, Student and Cultural Engagement at ASU, the To Be Welcoming curriculum, highly recommend. I've taken some of those. Links to University College, American Indian Student Support Services, and the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. So that wraps up our talk today. Any other final questions or comments? Let me look in the chat. Thank you, Celeste, for including those links. Perfect. All right, thank you so much, everybody. The recording of this will be put up on our website, and I'll also send those slides to everybody who registered. All right, have a great day.